In this tutorial, we'll have a look at how the scale and rotation properties of a layer work. So for that, I'm going to bring the sun in towards the center here first, and I'll press Shift/. Let's start with scale. If you remember, the shortcut for scale was S, so I'm going to go and press S, and that will reveal my scale property. And scale, as you can see, will have two values, and these are measured in percent. So by default, the layers are going to be 100%. You can make this lower or higher, again the same way, by clicking and dragging this, so that gets smaller, or drag it towards right to make it larger. Or of course you can click and type in a value as well, so if I want this to be exactly half the size, I can just go and type in 50%. And you see, although I'm changing one value, the two numbers update at the same time. That's because by default, when you scale something, After Effects wants to constrain the proportions of that layer so that it doesn't get squashed or stretched. You can of course turn this off. Then I can squash and stretch this by changing these values individually now. So if I go and extend the X towards right, you see it'll get stretched out or squashed in, and the same applies to the Y as well, like that. And if I go and click back on this button to constrain the proportions again, the proportions are now going to be constrained to what I'm seeing now. So it's already a squashed layer, so the proportions are going to stay like that. So if I go and increase one of these or decrease this, it's going to have exactly the same squashed proportions. Now to reset a property, and this applies to any property, you can go and right click on the name of the property. So if I go right click here where it says scale, I can go and reset this easily, and that will set the scale back to its default 100%. Another way to control the scale of a layer is by using the selection tool again, and then clicking on one of these control points. When you have the layer selected, you'll reveal these control points. You can click and then drag this, and by default it's going to be a scale that's not constrained. So I can now hold down the Shift key. That will again constrain the proportions of the scale. And now even if I try and drag it towards right, it's not doing anything, because I need to drag this diagonally, so it drags right and down at the same time, and the same applies going inwards as well. That's going up and left at the same time. So holding down the Shift key will constrain the proportions of the scale. Again, if you remember from the previous tutorial, you hold down the Shift key after you clicked on one of these buttons, which means you click first to initiate the scale, and then you hold the Shift key down to constrain the scale to be proportional. Another way to scale a layer up and down is by using Command or Control on Windows, and then using the plus and minus buttons on the numeric keypad. This is the keypad on the right side of your keyboard. So if I hold down Command and then use plus, this will scale the layer up by 1% at a time. And if I do Command minus, that will scale the layer down by 1% at a time. And just like moving the layers, if you hold down the Shift key together with your Command key now, if you then press plus or minus, that's going to scale the layer up and down by 10% at a time. So that's Command, Shift, and then plus, Command, Shift, minus on the numeric keypad. This isn't the plus or minus on the main keyboard next to the backspace, because those are used to zoom in and out. So if I hold down Command and use the plus and minus on the main keyboard, that's going to zoom in or out, rather than making the object larger or smaller. You may have noticed, as I make the object larger and larger and larger, the quality of it degrades. So if I go make this even larger, like that, you see the edges are looking very soft. Let me exaggerate this a little more. So I'm going to go click and drag this with the Shift key, and then maybe move the whole thing up so I can see the edges here. You can see that the quality is really bad. That's because this is now about 1100% of the original size. Now the whole point of using Illustrator initially to create these graphics was so that we could end up with vector files, and if you know anything about vectors, you should know that they can be scaled infinitely without losing any quality. And in this case, I can see that the quality has been lost. And that's because After Effects takes a file, even if it's a vector file, and it rasterizes it at the same size as the composition, so it looks sharp if you're seeing this at 100%. But it doesn't do anything else to that vector file again. Which means if you scale the vector file up, it doesn't recognize that vector file as a vector file, or a vector layer in this case. So in order to tell After Effects that this in fact is a vector file and you want to keep the layer's edges quite sharp, you click on this button here, the one that we mentioned in the previous tutorial, the one that looks like the sun, next to the shy switch. This button is called Continuously Rasterize, and what that means is that it's going to look at the vector file, and it will look at the scale property, and in this case we set the scale to be about 1100%, and it then calculates that, and based on those figures it rasterizes the layer, so the layer looks sharp at this scale. The reason why it's turned off by default is because the more of these layers you have with this switch turned on, the slower the renders are going to get. So to make it easier on the processor, After Effects by default turns these switches off. But if you are working with vector files, you usually want to turn these buttons on so you can scale them freely. So this is the one before, and this is after. Now don't confuse this with the zoom level. So if I actually zoom into it, so if I use my scroll wheel and the Alt key and maybe zoom in here, this also looks a little pixelated now, but this isn't due to the scale value being set to about 1100% or the switch being turned on or turned off. This is purely because we have our magnification level set to be about 3000%. So if I zoom out and set this to be 100%, we should be checking the quality of this at 100% view all the time. So if it looks sharp at this magnification level, we'll be alright. Let's set the scale back to 100%, so I'm going to select and just type in 100. And I'm going to press Shift / so I can see the whole thing. The sun layer seems to have disappeared, so let me zoom out a couple of times. There is my layer, so I'll just go bring this back in. And then zoom into it again by holding down Alt and scrolling in. That brings the sun here. Let me set the scale to, let's say, 250%. And then next is rotation. If I go and press R, I now see two values here, and rotation is measured in degrees. So you usually change the second value here. This is the degrees here. So if I click and drag the second one towards right, you see as soon as I do this, the sun is going to start rotating. That's going to rotate clockwise. And if you go towards left, that's counterclockwise. And if you go over 360, check what happens to this first number here. So if I just keep going towards right. And as soon as we reach 360, After Effects is going to zero out this number, and it's going to add 1 to the number on the left. So that's the amount of full revolutions that the layer has made. So if I keep dragging this towards right, you see this goes to 0 and it starts all over again, and we now have 1 on the left hand side. This means now that the layer has done a full rotation plus 135 degrees. Which means really, if you change the first number here, nothing's going to change. Not unless you're animating something. We'll talk about animation in the future tutorials, but for now, if you change the first number, that's not going to have any effect on the appearance of the layer. Because if you rotate the layer by 360 degrees, you're going to come back to exactly where you started. That's why changing this number to anything, even if I set this to, let's say, I don't know, 5000, that's not going to make any difference until we start animating. So let me reset the value as well here. So I'm going to go and right click on the word rotation and then reset this. And I'll show you another way of rotating the layer, and that's by using the rotation tool here. This is the fourth tool from the left. The keyboard shortcut is W. If you select this, we can then go and click anywhere on the layer and simply just click and drag, and that's going to rotate the layer. And as I do this, you'll see that the numbers on the bottom left will update. If I hold down Shift, that's going to lock the rotation to be 45-degree increments. So if I click and drag with the Shift key, you'll see it goes 45, 90, 135, 180, and so on. Again, you let go of your mouse first before you let go of the Shift key. I'll press V to get back to my selection tool. One last way of rotating a layer is again by using the plus and minus keys on the numeric keypad. This time, we don't use the modifier key, we just simply press plus or minus. These are the keys on the numeric keypad, remember, not the main keyboard, so the keypad on the right hand side of your keyboard. If I press plus, this rotates the layer by 1 degree at a time, and minus will go counterclockwise by 1 degree at a time. And again, if you hold down the Shift key, it will rotate by 10 degrees at a time.